The silence out here was the first thing that truly unnerved me. In the city, silence was a myth, a brief pause between sirens and the rumble of the subway deep in the earth's guts. Here, under the oppressive Wyoming sky, silence was a physical presence. It was heavy, weighted with the scent of dust and distant rain, and it pressed in on me, forcing me to listen to the frantic, useless chatter of my own mind. I had been here for 3 weeks, a refugee from a life that had unceremoniously collapsed. My graphic design career, my shoebox apartment with its view of a brick wall, my carefully curated illusion of purpose, all gone, swallowed by a corporate merger and an eviction notice. My only port in this storm was my Uncle Frank's ranch, a place I hadn't seen since I was a child who still believed in cowboys. Frank, a man whose face was a roadmap of sun and worry, had taken one look at my soft hands and city pallor and set me to the one task he figured I couldn't screw up too badly: mending the endless stretches of fence that lined the property. It was solitary work, which suited the bruised state of my ego. It also gave me an uninterrupted vantage point from which to observe the real rhythm of this place, a rhythm dictated not by clocks, but by the sun and the needs of living things. And at the center of that rhythm, the unwavering metronome, was Cole. He was the ranch foreman, a man who seemed less to work the land than to be a part of it. I saw him for the first time on my second day. I was fumbling with a wire stretcher, my fingers clumsy and alien, when he rode up on a dun-colored mare. He didn't announce his presence. The world just seemed to quiet and focus around him. He was tall, with the kind of lean, dense muscle that comes from labor, not a gym. His face was all angles and shadows under the brim of a sweat-stained cowboy hat, and his eyes, when they briefly met mine, were the color of moss, deep and unreadable. He watched me struggle for a moment, a long, patient moment where I felt my incompetence being measured and catalogued. Then, without a word, he dismounted. The motion was fluid, economical. He moved like he was conserving energy for something important, and my fumbling was not it. He took the tool from my hand, his knuckles brushing mine. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt up my arm that was entirely out of proportion to the event. His hands were calloused and stained, but his touch was surprisingly gentle as he repositioned the wire. "You gotta brace it here," he said. His voice was a low rumble, like stones shifting deep underground. It was the first time he'd spoken directly to me. "Otherwise, you'll never get the tension right," he demonstrated, his movements precise and certain. Then he handed the tool back to me, his gaze lingering for a fraction of a second. It wasn't a question, not quite a challenge, but it was something. It was an acknowledgement that I was there. Then he was back on his horse, a silhouette against the endless blue, and gone. That was the beginning of my obsession. Not a loud, frantic obsession, but a quiet, pervasive one, like the dust that settled on every surface. My days became a study of Cole. I watched him from my lonely stretch of fence line, a silent observer documenting the economy of his movements. I learned the language of his body because he offered so little else. The set of his shoulders could tell you if a storm was coming or if a calf was sick. The slight tilt of his hat could signal fatigue or satisfaction. He spoke rarely, and when he did, his words were practical, stripped of ornament. He communicated with horses in a low murmur, a language of soft clicks and gentle pressure that they seemed to understand perfectly. I envied them that intimacy. The other hands, a rotating cast of sun-weathered men named Dale and Jimmy and Gus, treated him with a mixture of respect and distance. They joked with each other, their laughter loud and rough in the clear air, but their humor always seemed to slide off Cole, leaving him untouched. He wasn't unfriendly, just contained. He existed in a space of his own making, a quiet territory I found myself desperately wanting to enter. I started to notice the small things. The way the sun caught the stray hairs at the nape of his neck, turning them to gold. The deep lines that fanned from the corners of his eyes when he scanned the horizon. The scent that clung to him, not cologne, but something far more elemental: leather, sweat, hay, and the clean, sharp smell of the wind itself. I would find excuses to be in the barn when he was, pretending to look for a tool I didn't need, just to be in his orbit, to breathe the same air. He would nod at me, a brief, almost imperceptible dip of his chin, and my heart would perform a frantic, hopeful little tap dance in my chest. My internal monologue was a relentless, exhausting loop. Did he look at me for a second too long, just now? Was that nod different from yesterday's nod? When he handed me that canteen, did his fingers linger on mine? Or am I just desperate? I was a detective in a case with no crime and only one suspect, gathering meaningless clues and arranging them into patterns of hope and despair. I was pathetic, and I knew it. But the feeling, this slow, creeping warmth that was spreading through my chest, was the only thing that made me feel alive after months of feeling numb. It was a dangerous, fragile thing, and I nurtured it in the vast, lonely silence of the plains. One afternoon, about a month into my sentence, the old well pump that fed the north pasture sputtered and died. Frank assigned Cole to fix it, and then, to my utter shock and terror, he looked at me. "Leo, you go with him. He'll need a hand holding things." My stomach plummeted. A hand holding things. I was more likely to be a foot tripping over things. The thought of spending hours, maybe a whole day, in close proximity to Cole, under his direct and unavoidable scrutiny, was both intoxicating and terrifying. The drive out was mostly silent. Cole handled the old ranch truck with the same effortless competence he did everything else, one hand resting lightly on the wheel. I sat in the passenger seat, rigid, my hands clasped in my lap like a nervous schoolboy. I was intensely aware of the space between us, a gap of maybe 18 inches that felt both like a chasm and a single, tense breath. The truck smelled of him, that same mix of sun-baked earth and leather, and I found myself taking small, surreptitious breaths of it, filling my lungs with his presence. "You're quiet," he said, his eyes on the dusty track ahead. The statement landed in the cab with the weight of an anvil. "Just thinking," I managed, my voice sounding thin. "What about?" He glanced at me then, just for a second, and those moss-green eyes held a flicker of genuine curiosity. My mind went completely blank. What was I thinking about? I was thinking about the way his worn denim jeans fit his thighs. I was thinking about the calluses on his hands and what they would feel like on my skin. I was thinking about how I was going to make it through the next several hours without spontaneously combusting from anxiety and unspoken want. The city. I lied, seizing the first plausible thing that came to mind. "It's just different." A small, humorless smile touched his lips. "Yeah, I guess it is," and that was it. The conversation died, and we lapsed back into a silence that now felt charged, as if my lie had hung a curtain of static between us. I spent the rest of the ride staring out the window, watching the landscape blur by, my mind racing. I was analyzing his smile. It wasn't a mocking smile, was it? It was more knowing, as if he knew I was lying, as if he could see right through the flimsy facade I had constructed and was just waiting, patiently, for it to crumble. The pump was in a remote corner of the property, a lonely sentinel in a sea of waving grass. It was an ancient, rusted contraption that looked like it belonged in a museum. We worked for hours under the hot sun. My job, as Frank had predicted, was mostly to hold things. I held wrenches. I held pipes. I held a flashlight as Cole, stripped to a white t-shirt that was soon soaked with sweat and grease, wrestled with a particularly stubborn bolt. His muscles bunched and coiled in his arms and back, a beautiful, functional display of strength. I tried not to stare. I failed spectacularly. He must have felt my eyes on him, because he paused, wiping a forearm across his brow. He looked up at me, his face smudged with grease, and his gaze was direct, unwavering. It wasn't accusatory. It was just a look. A long, searching look. I felt my face flush, a hot wave of shame and exposure washing over me. I looked away, down at my own clean, useless hands. "You're gonna get sunburnt," he said, his voice softer than usual. I just nodded, unable to speak. He turned back to the bolt, and with a final grunt of effort, it broke free. He worked for another hour, his movements efficient and sure, while I stood by, a silent, awkward statue. The sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in lurid shades of orange and purple. It was clear we weren't going to finish before dark. "We'll have to camp here tonight," Cole said, stating it as a simple fact. No point trying to navigate those tracks in the dark. My heart did that stupid little dance again, a frantic pitter-patter of fear and excitement. A whole night, alone with him, out here, where the silence was absolute. He pulled 2 bedrolls and a small cooler from the back of the truck. He built a fire with the same practiced ease he did everything else, and soon we were sitting on opposite sides of the crackling flames, eating cold sandwiches Frank's wife had packed for us. The firelight danced across his face, throwing his sharp features into dramatic relief. The silence between us felt different now, less tense. It was a shared silence, filled with the crackle of the fire and the chirping of crickets. I watched him stare into the flames, his expression thoughtful, unguarded for the first time. The stoic mask of the foreman had slipped, and in its place was just a man, watching a fire under a vast, star-dusted sky. I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to know him, to know what he was thinking, what he dreamed of in this quiet, solitary life. "Do you ever miss it?" I asked, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. He looked at me, his head tilted. "Miss what? Anything else?" The world outside of this ranch. He was quiet for a long time, so long that I thought he wasn't going to answer. I was about to apologize, to retreat back into my shell, when he finally spoke, his voice low and contemplative. "Sometimes I think about the ocean," he said, his gaze returning to the fire. "Never seen it. Just pictures." He paused. "But this is enough. The sky is big enough here. You can breathe." His words hung in the air between us, simple and profound. You can breathe. In the city, I had felt like I was constantly suffocating, squeezed by expectations and noise, and the relentless pressure to be something, to achieve something. Here, under this immense sky, with this quiet, steady man, I felt like I could finally draw a full breath. "I know what you mean," I said softly. And for the first time, it wasn't a lie. He looked at me then, a real look, one that went past the surface. And for the first time, I didn't look away. In the flickering firelight, I thought I saw a reflection of my own yearning in his eyes, a shared loneliness that transcended the vast differences in our lives. It was a fleeting moment, a trick of the light, maybe, but it was enough. It was a seed of hope planted in the barren ground of my heart. We laid out our bedrolls a respectful distance apart. I lay on my back for hours, staring up at the Milky Way, a brilliant, impossible smear of light that you could never see from the city. I was intensely aware of Cole, of the sound of his steady breathing just a few feet away. I listened to it until it became a lullaby, a rhythm that matched the slow, hopeful beat of my own heart. And for the first time since I had arrived, the silence didn't feel oppressive. It felt like a promise. The next morning, the pump was fixed within an hour. The drive back was as quiet as the drive out, but the quality of the silence had changed. It was no longer a void, but a shared space. A comfortable quiet that didn't need to be filled with pointless chatter. When we got back to the ranch, he gave me one of his characteristic nods, but this time, the corner of his mouth ticked up in a small, almost imperceptible smile. "You did good, Leo." The simple praise, from this man of few words, felt like winning a medal. I spent the rest of the day replaying it in my mind, analyzing the smile, the tone of his voice, hoarding the memory like a precious jewel. Something had shifted between us out there, under the stars. A wall had been breached, a connection forged in the shared silence and the simple act of holding a wrench. It was a fragile beginning, but it was a beginning nonetheless. The weeks that followed settled into a new rhythm. The distance between us had lessened, not just physically, but emotionally. Our interactions were still brief, still rooted in the practicalities of ranch work, but they were different. There was an undercurrent now, a low hum of awareness that ran beneath every shared glance, every brief conversation. He started seeking me out, not in any overt way, but I'd look up from my work and he'd be there, leaning against a fence post, watching me. He'd offer a piece of advice, a quiet suggestion on how to do a task more efficiently. He taught me how to properly saddle a horse, his hands guiding mine on the leather straps, his body close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from him. His touch was always practical, always instructional, but it lingered. A hand on my shoulder, a brush of his arm against mine. Each touch was a small spark, and I was a tinderbox, waiting for a flame. My internal analysis went into overdrive. I became a scholar of Cole, my field of study his micro-expressions, the subtle shifts in his voice, the language of his hands. I learned that a muscle ticking in his jaw meant he was annoyed, not with me, but usually with a stubborn piece of machinery. I learned that his eyes crinkled at the corners not just when he was scanning the horizon, but when he was quietly amused by something. And sometimes, I caught him looking at me with an expression I couldn't decipher, a mixture of intensity and something softer, something that looked almost like longing. But I always dismissed it. It was just wishful thinking, my own desperate heart projecting its feelings onto him. One sweltering afternoon, I was tasked with cleaning out the tack room, a small, cluttered space that smelled richly of leather and horse sweat. It was a mindless, dusty job, and I was lost in it, humming to myself, when the doorway was suddenly filled with Cole's silhouette. "Need a hand?" he asked. I jumped, startled. "Oh, no, I'm good. Just dusty." He didn't leave. He stepped inside, and the small room seemed to shrink around him. He leaned against the wall, crossing his arms over his chest, and just watched me work. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with the afternoon heat and unspoken words. I grew flustered under his steady gaze, my movements becoming clumsy. I dropped a bridle, the metal bit clattering loudly on the concrete floor. "Sorry," I mumbled, bending to pick it up. As I straightened up, he was right there, in front of me. He hadn't seemed to move, but the space between us had vanished. He reached out and gently brushed a smudge of dust from my cheek with his thumb. His touch was feather-light, but it burned a trail on my skin. My breath hitched in my throat. I looked up into his eyes, and the world seemed to slow down. They were so close, those moss-green eyes, and for the first time, they weren't unreadable. They were filled with a raw, undisguised hunger that mirrored my own. My heart is hammering against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the sudden, deafening silence of the tack room. I can't breathe. I can't think. All I can do is feel the rough pad of his thumb on my skin, see the slight parting of his lips, smell the scent of him. So close, so overwhelming. This is it. This is the moment. But then, from outside, came the sound of the other hands returning, their voices loud and boisterous. The spell was broken. Cole blinked, and the hunger in his eyes was gone, replaced by the familiar, guarded mask. He took a step back, putting a universe of distance between us. He cleared his throat. "Just be careful with that old leather," he said, his voice rough. "It's brittle," and then he was gone. I stood there for a long time, my hand pressed to my cheek where he had touched me, my body trembling. It wasn't my imagination. I hadn't projected it. It was real. That look, that touch, it was real. The knowledge was a terrifying, exhilarating thing. The slow burn had finally ignited, and I had no idea what to do with the fire. The tension after the tackroom incident was unbearable. It was a living thing, a third presence that followed us everywhere. We avoided each other. The easy, quiet companionship we had started to build was gone, replaced by a strained, awkward silence. When our eyes met across the dinner table or in the yard, we both looked away quickly, like we'd touched a hot stove. The air between us crackled with unspoken words, with the memory of that moment, of what had almost happened. I was a wreck. I replayed the scene in my mind 1,000 times. The look in his eyes, the feel of his thumb on my cheek. It had been real. I was sure of it. But his retreat, his immediate return to the stoic, distant foreman, filled me with doubt. Had I misread everything? Was he just being kind, and I, in my loneliness, had twisted it into something more? The thought was humiliating. I felt raw, exposed, like he had seen the pathetic, desperate core of me and had recoiled in pity or disgust. The other hands must have noticed the shift. I caught Jimmy and Dale giving us strange looks. One evening, as we were cleaning up after dinner, Dale clapped me on the shoulder, his touch startlingly heavy. "You and the boss have a tiff?" he asked, a knowing smirk on his face. I felt my face heat. "What? No. I don't know what you're talking about." "Sure you don't," he drawled, winking at Jimmy. "Just seems awful quiet between you two." Like a cold front moved in, their casual teasing felt like a physical blow. It made my secret, fragile feelings seem sordid and obvious. I mumbled an excuse and fled, my cheeks burning with shame. I went to the one place I felt I could be alone, the large, empty barn at the edge of the property. The barn was my sanctuary. It was cool and dark, filled with the comforting, earthy smells of hay and old wood. The vast, vaulted ceiling made my anxieties feel small and manageable. I leaned against a rough-hewn wooden post, closing my eyes and trying to force my racing heart to slow down. I needed to get a grip. This was just a summer job. Soon I would be gone, back to my own life, whatever that was. This thing with Cole, whatever it was a temporary madness, a product of loneliness and isolation. I had to forget it. I had to let it go. The tipping point came a few days later. It was a Saturday night, and Frank had given everyone the evening off. The other hands had driven into the nearest town, a dusty collection of buildings with one blinking traffic light, in search of cheap beer and female company. I had declined their invitation, pleading fatigue. The thought of spending hours in a loud, crowded bar, pretending to be interested in things I wasn't, was exhausting. I was sitting on the porch of the bunkhouse, reading a worn paperback, when a few of the guys returned, earlier than expected and much louder. They were drunk, their laughter sharp and ugly. They stumbled onto the porch, and one of them, a newer hand named Travis whose cruelty was directly proportional to his alcohol intake, noticed me. "Well, look what we got here," he slurred, leaning over me. "The city boy, all alone with his little book. Too good for a beer with the boys, huh?" I tried to ignore him, keeping my eyes on my book. "I was just tired, Travis, tired," he sneered. "Or maybe you just don't like girls. That it? You one of those queers." The word, spat with such casual venom, landed like a punch to the gut. I froze. My whole body went cold. I had heard that word, in that tone, many times before. It had been hurled at me from passing cars, whispered in school hallways. It had always been a source of fear and shame, a label I had spent my life trying to outrun. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. My throat had closed up. I just stared at the page of my book, the words blurring into meaningless shapes. Travis laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Look at him. Can't even deny it. Knew there was something wrong with you. That's enough." The voice came from the darkness at the edge of the porch. It was low, quiet, but it cut through the drunken haze like a razor. Cole stepped into the light. He wasn't looking at me. His eyes were fixed on Travis, and they were chips of ice. I had never seen him look so cold, so dangerous. Travis, emboldened by alcohol, puffed out his chest. "What's it to you, boss?" "Just having a little fun," I said. Cole repeated, taking another step forward, his voice dropping even lower. "That's enough. Go sleep it off." Now, there was no room for argument in his tone. It was a command, absolute and final. Travis held his gaze for a moment, his drunken bravado warring with a primal instinct for self-preservation. Instinct 1. He muttered something under his breath and stumbled away, the other hands shuffling after him like chastened dogs. The porch was suddenly silent. I still hadn't moved. I was paralyzed, a storm of shame, fear, and a bewildering surge of gratitude warring inside me. Cole stood there for a moment, his broad shoulders blocking the light from the bunkhouse. Then he walked over to me. He didn't say anything. He just crouched down in front of me, so we were at eye level. His face was etched with a concern I had never seen there before. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft, the anger completely gone. I couldn't meet his eyes. I just stared at my hands, which were trembling in my lap. I gave a small, jerky nod. "Leo," he said my name, and the way he said it, so gentle, so full of a quiet, fierce protectiveness, was my undoing. A single, hot tear escaped and rolled down my cheek. I hastily wiped it away, mortified. He reached out, as if to touch my arm, but then hesitated, his hand hovering in the space between us. The air was thick with everything we hadn't said, with the truth that Travis had so brutally exposed. The loaded silence stretched on, a taut wire of tension. I felt like if he touched me, I would shatter. And if he didn't, I would break. I finally found my voice, but it was a ragged whisper. I should go. I made to stand up, to flee, to find somewhere to hide with my shame. But his hand shot out and grabbed my wrist. His grip was firm, not painful, but unyielding. "Don't," he said, his voice a low plea. I looked at him then, really looked at him. And in his eyes, I saw it all. The worry, the anger on my behalf, and something else, something deeper. The same raw hunger from the tack room. But this time it was tempered with a profound tenderness. There was no hiding anymore. Not for either of us. The truth was out, laid bare on the dusty porch of a Wyoming bunkhouse, and we had to face it. I couldn't stay there. I couldn't sit on that porch with his hand on my wrist, and the raw, unvarnished truth hanging between us. My fight-or-flight instinct, honed by years of hiding, screamed at me, and my choice was always flight. I pulled my wrist from his grasp, the motion jerky and panicked. "I can't," I whispered, not to him, but to myself, to the situation. I stood up on trembling legs and practically ran, stumbling off the porch and into the darkness. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to move, to put distance between myself and that look in his eyes, a look that promised to dismantle every wall I had ever built. My feet carried me, by instinct, to my sanctuary, the barn. I pushed open the heavy door and slipped inside, the familiar scent of hay and old leather a small comfort. It was pitch black, the only light a pale silver rectangle from the high window where the moon shone through. I leaned against the rough wall, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my heart feeling like a trapped bird beating against my ribs. What had I done? I had run from the one person who had stood up for me, the one person who had looked at me with something other than pity or disgust. I was a coward. I pressed the heels of my hands into my eyes, trying to block out the image of his face, the hurt and confusion in his expression as I pulled away. A moment later, the barn door creaked open again, spilling a shaft of light into the darkness before closing, plunging us back into shadow. I didn't need to see him to know it was Cole. I could feel his presence. It filled the vast space, a solid, unwavering certainty in my chaotic world. I could hear his soft footfalls on the dirt floor, the quiet rustle of his denim jeans. He was coming closer. Leo, his voice was soft in the cavernous space, but it echoed in my soul. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I just squeezed my eyes shut tighter, bracing myself. For what? I didn't know. Rejection? Anger? Pity? He stopped a few feet away from me. I could feel his body heat, hear his steady breathing. The silence was absolute, a held breath. Stop running, he said, and it wasn't a command. It was a plea, laced with a weariness that seemed to go bone deep. When I still didn't respond, he moved. In 2 quick strides, he closed the distance between us. His hands came up to grip my shoulders, and he gently, inexorably, turned me around and pressed me back against the barn wall. My back hit the rough wood with a soft thud. He didn't slam me. The action was deliberate, controlled. He was bracketing me, one hand on the wall on either side of my head, his body a warm, solid barrier in front of me. He was so close. I could feel the heat of his chest through my shirt. I could smell the faint, clean scent of soap mixed with his own unique, earthy scent. I finally opened my eyes. In the dim moonlight filtering through the high window, his face was a landscape of shadows and silver. His expression was fiercely intense, his jaw tight. He was searching my face, his eyes moving over my features as if trying to memorize them, or to read the answer to a question he hadn't yet asked. What Travis said, I started, my voice cracking, needing to explain, to apologize, to say something. I don't care what Travis said. He cut me off, his voice a low, rough growl. I care that he hurt you. He leaned in closer, and my breath hitched. Our faces were inches apart. I could see the flecks of gold in his moss-green eyes. And I care that you ran from me. My heart is a frantic, wild thing. Time seems to have stopped. There is only the cool, rough wood at my back and the solid, radiating heat of him in front of me. The scent of him, hay, leather, man, is all-consuming. This is it. The culmination of weeks of stolen glances, of unspoken tension, of a slow, simmering burn that is about to erupt. I was scared. I admitted, the confession a raw, fragile whisper in the charged silence. A flicker of something, understanding, pain, tenderness, crossed his features. Me too, he breathed, and the admission seemed to cost him everything. And then he closed the final, infinitesimal distance between us. His lips met mine. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was hungry, desperate, a release of all the pent-up frustration and longing that had been arcing between us for weeks. It was a kiss that tasted of dust and whiskey and a desperate, unspoken need. His mouth was firm and searching, and I responded with an equal, startling ferocity, my hands coming up to grip his shirt, pulling him closer, trying to erase any space that remained between us. It was everything. It was the answer to every question my heart had been asking. It was harsh and demanding, but underneath it all was a current of profound tenderness. His calloused hand moved from the wall to the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair, holding me to him as he deepened the kiss. My mind went blessedly, blissfully blank. There was no more overthinking, no more analysis. There was only this. Only him. The solid wall at my back, the unyielding strength of his body pressed against mine, the breathtaking, overwhelming reality of his mouth on mine. It felt like coming home to a place I had never been before. It was a consummation not just of desire, but of feeling. It was honest. It was real. And it was not rushed. It was the slow, inevitable collision of two lonely souls in the moonlit dark of a Wyoming barn. The world came back into focus slowly, reluctantly. The kiss softened, the initial desperation giving way to a slower, deeper exploration. His lips were surprisingly soft against mine. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. He didn't move away. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed. I could feel his breath, warm and quick, on my lips. My hands were still fisted in his shirt, my knuckles pressed against the hard plane of his chest. His hand was still at the nape of my neck, his thumb stroking softly, sending shivers down my spine. We stood like that for a long time, in the quiet darkness, just breathing each other in. The frantic energy had subsided, replaced by a profound, trembling peace. The silence was no longer a weight or a weapon. It was a blanket, a shared space of incredible intimacy. "Leo," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He didn't say anything else. He just said my name, as if it were a prayer, a question, and an answer all at once. I opened my eyes and looked at him. The guarded walls were gone. In the pale moonlight, his face was completely open, vulnerable. The stoic ranch foreman had vanished, and in his place was just Cole, a man who looked as shaken and overwhelmed as I felt. I laced my fingers with his, my hand feeling small and smooth in his rough, calloused one. The simple act of our hands joining felt more significant, more binding, than the kiss itself. It was a conscious choice, a new connection. "I'm not running anymore," I said, my voice quiet but steady. A slow, beautiful smile spread across his face, transforming his rugged features. It was the first real, unguarded smile I had ever seen from him, and it was breathtaking. It reached his eyes, making them shine in the dark. "Good," he said, his voice a low, happy rumble. "Because I'm not letting you go." The next morning, I woke to the thin, gray light of dawn filtering into the bunkhouse. For a disoriented moment, I didn't know where I was. Then the memories of the night before came rushing back. Travis's ugly words, Cole's quiet fury, the barn, the kiss. My body flushed with a mixture of heat and panic. I sat up abruptly, my heart pounding. The bunkhouse was quiet, the other hands still sleeping off their hangovers. I looked across at Cole's empty bunk. The blankets were neatly folded. He was gone. A cold dread washed over me, chilling me to the bone. It was exactly what I had feared. He regretted it. The harsh light of day had chased away the moonlight and the madness. He had woken up and realized his mistake, and now he was avoiding me. The thought was a physical pain, a sharp, twisting ache in my chest. I had let myself be vulnerable, had allowed that fragile seed of hope to sprout, only to have it stomped out by the morning sun. I was a fool. I dressed quickly, my movements stiff and clumsy. I had to get out of there. I couldn't face him. I couldn't bear to see the pity or disgust in his eyes. The communal breakfast in the main house was an ordeal I couldn't possibly endure. I would skip it, hide out, maybe go back to my lonely stretch of fence line and try to piece my shattered composure back together. I slipped out of the bunkhouse and into the cool, crisp morning air. The sun was just beginning to crest the horizon, painting the eastern sky in soft shades of pink and gold. The ranch was quiet, still waking up. I started walking, my head down, my destination nowhere in particular, just away. "Leo," his voice stopped me in my tracks. It came from the direction of the main house. I turned slowly, my stomach churning with anxiety. He was standing on the porch, a steaming mug of coffee in his hand. He was showered, dressed in a clean shirt. He just stood there, watching me, his expression unreadable from this distance. I waited for him to say something, to deliver the blow, to tell me that last night was a mistake. But he just stood there, waiting. The silence stretched, and my anxiety grew with every passing second. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know. I walked toward him, my legs feeling like lead, my heart preparing for the inevitable impact. When I reached the bottom of the porch steps, I stopped. I still couldn't bring myself to meet his eyes. I just stared at his worn leather boots. "Morning," he said, his voice quiet, calm. "Morning," I mumbled back to the ground. The silence descended again, heavy and awkward. I could feel his gaze on the top of my head. This was it. The morning after unease, a cold, empty space where last night's warmth had been. My internal monologue was screaming at me. Just get it over with. Say something. Let him reject you so you can move on. He came down the steps then, stopping right in front of me. He gently put a finger under my chin and tilted my head up, forcing me to look at him. His eyes were clear and steady, and they held no trace of regret. Only a quiet, searching concern. I woke up this morning, he said, his voice a low, intimate rumble that was meant only for me. And the first thing I thought was, I felt safe. He paused, letting the words sink in. I haven't felt that way in a long time. His simple, honest confession was a balm to my frayed nerves. It was the reassurance I so desperately needed, delivered without fanfare, without flowery language. Just the plain, unvarnished truth. The knot of fear in my stomach began to loosen. He took my hand then, his calloused fingers lacing through mine. It was a simple, deliberate gesture, a public claim in the quiet morning light. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't ashamed. He held my hand and looked me straight in the eye, and the world seemed to settle back on its axis. I'm not sorry, Leo, he said, his voice firm. Are you? A wave of relief so profound it almost buckled my knees washed over me. I shook my head, a small, jerky motion. No, I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. No, I'm not sorry. A slow smile touched his lips, the same beautiful, unguarded smile from the barn. Good. Now come on. You look like you could use some coffee. He led me up the steps and into the warm, fragrant kitchen of the main house. He didn't let go of my hand. The test, I realized, hadn't been his regret. It had been my own fear, my own deep-seated expectation of rejection. And for the first time in my life, I had been proven wrong. The days that followed were a quiet revelation. Nothing and everything had changed. On the surface, our lives on the ranch continued as they always had. We worked from sunup to sundown, the rhythm of our days dictated by the needs of the land and the animals. But underneath that familiar routine, a new current flowed between us, a deep, steady river of connection. We didn't talk about what we were. We didn't try to define it. There were no grand declarations. Instead, our relationship was built in the small moments, in the quiet spaces between the work. It was in the way he would bring me a cup of coffee in the morning, made just the way I liked it. It was in the way I would save him a seat at the dinner table. It was in the lingering touches, no longer ambiguous, but deliberate and full of meaning. A hand on the small of my back as I walked through a gate, his knee brushing against mine under the table, his fingers briefly tangling with mine as he passed me a tool. The other hands noticed, of course. It was impossible not to. Travis was fired the day after the incident on the porch, for reasons Frank never explained, but everyone understood. The others, Dale and Jimmy and Gus, seemed to take their cue from Cole. If the foreman had no problem with it, neither did they. There were no more jokes, no more smirks. There was just a quiet, unspoken acceptance. They treated me differently, with a new level of respect. I was no longer just the clumsy city boy. I was Cole's. The thought sent a thrill of possessive pride through me. My biggest test was internal. A lifetime of hiding, of feeling like there was something fundamentally wrong with me, was not a habit easily broken. There were moments of doubt, flashes of the old fear. Was this real? Could it last? I was a temporary fixture here, a summer refugee. What would happen when the season changed, when it was time for me to leave? The thought of going back to my old life, to the lonely silence of a city apartment, was now unbearable. That silence had been filled by the quiet, steady presence of this man. One evening, we were sitting on the top rail of the corral fence, watching the horses mill about in the fading light. It was a comfortable silence, the kind we had perfected. But my mind was churning with anxiety about the future. What are you thinking about? Cole asked, his shoulder pressed against mine. He had become an expert at reading my moods. I hesitated, then decided on the truth. The end of summer, I said quietly. He was silent for a moment. He reached out and picked a piece of straw from my hair, his touch gentle. What about it? I have to go back, I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. I don't have a job or a place to live, but I can't stay here forever. I'm not a rancher. He turned to look at me, his expression serious in the twilight. Is that what you want? To go back? The question hung in the air between us, simple and direct. And I knew, with an absolute certainty that settled deep in my bones, the answer. No, I said. No, It's not what I want, he nodded slowly, as if he had been waiting for that answer. Frank's getting old, he said, his gaze shifting to the horizon. He's been talking about needing a permanent hand, someone to help me run this place when he steps back. He turned back to me, his eyes searching mine. The pay is terrible. The hours are worse. But there's a small cabin down by the creek. It's not much, but it's quiet. And the sky is big enough. He was offering me a future. Not a promise of forever, not a declaration of love, but something more real, more tangible. A choice, a place, a reason to stay. It was a conscious decision laid out before me, as vast and open as the Wyoming sky. Tears welled in my eyes, blurring the silhouette of his face against the deepening purple of the sky. This man, this quiet, steady man, had seen me. He had seen past the clumsy city boy, past the fear and the insecurity, and had seen someone worth keeping. He had offered me a home. I didn't need to say yes. He saw the answer in my eyes. He reached out and cupped my cheek, his rough thumb wiping away a tear. He leaned in and kissed me, a slow, gentle kiss that was full of promise. It wasn't a desperate, hungry kiss like the one in the barn. It was a kiss that felt like a foundation, like the beginning of something solid and lasting. We didn't go back to the bunkhouse that night. He took my hand and led me in the darkness down a winding path I'd never been on before. We arrived at a small, simple cabin nestled in a grove of cottonwood trees. The sound of the creek was a gentle murmur nearby. He unlocked the door and led me inside. It was one room, clean and sparse, with a bed, a small kitchen, and a stone fireplace. It smelled of cedar and wood smoke. It smelled like him. We didn't talk. We didn't need to. He built a fire in the fireplace, the flames casting a warm, dancing glow over the room. We lay down on the bed together, still fully clothed, and he pulled a thick wool blanket over us. I rested my head on his chest, listening to the slow, steady beat of his heart. His arms wrapped around me, holding me securely. This was the quiet intimacy I had never known I was searching for. It wasn't about sex or passion in that moment. It was about something deeper. It was the feeling of being completely, utterly safe, of being known, of being home. I lay there, listening to the crackle of the fire and the steady rhythm of his breathing, and I thought about the man I was when I arrived here just a few months ago. Lost, lonely, a passive observer of my own life. I had come to this place to escape, and instead, I had found a reason to stay. I had found a quiet man who spoke in actions rather than words, who had stood up for me when I couldn't stand up for myself, who had followed me into the dark and shown me I didn't have to be afraid. He shifted, his hand coming up to stroke my hair. "You're quiet," he murmured, the same words he had said to me on that first truck ride out to the broken pump. I smiled against his chest. "Just thinking," I said. He waited, and I knew he was asking the same question. "What about?" "I'm thinking," I said, my voice soft in the warm, fire-lit room, "that I can finally breathe." His arm tightened around me, a silent affirmation. Outside, the Wyoming wind whispered through the cottonwood trees, but in here, in this small cabin, in his arms, there was only a profound and perfect peace. I was no longer just an observer. I was here. I was home. And our new beginning was as quiet and as certain as the sunrise that I knew would soon be cresting over the mountains.